the hardest part was probably dating girls saying that, no, you're not my type. No, I would never date an Asian guy. Things like that got to me, and I became so shy. Even to this day, dating is very difficult because I'm so scared of rejection. If you manage to make it, if you become successful, then people get jealous. I think it's out of jealousy. But in France, it's the relation to money and to success is not very good. If you go have tea with someone that was planned, but you didn't plan on having dinner with that person, and then, you start talking and you're having a nice conversation. It's 6 o'clock and the person says, "Oh, would you like to stay for dinner maybe?" Then it's your cue to leave.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dating Beyond Borders podcast. Today, I'm excited to introduce Bong, a French-Japanese creator currently living in Montreal who makes videos about languages. In this episode, we'll dive into Bong's experience growing up as a third culture kid, explore whether he feels more Japanese or French or Lebanese, and how that influences his personality. We'll also discuss the differences between French and Japanese cultures and chat about life in Europe versus North America. So welcome, Bong.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you.
Good to see you again. For anyone that doesn't know, Bong and I actually met in person years ago when filming, You're Dating a Lebanese Man video. And that reel went viral as well, the one with you in it.
Cool.
Yeah.
When was that again? Like 5 years ago or something?
Oh my God. I feel like it's been longer, hasn't it? I feel like it's definitely been, I think 6 years. Yeah, about 5, 6 years. Yeah, it's about this. Yeah, exactly. Around that time frame. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's nice to see you again. And I did say French, Japanese. I wasn't sure if I should say Japanese, French. But yeah, let's hear your story. So explain it to us. So you're Japanese, French, correct?
Yeah. So my dad is half French, half Lebanese, and my mom is Japanese. And I was born and I grew up in France.
Mm-hmm. So when people ask you, where are you from? Do you give them that whole story?
Well, I usually say I was born and raised in France. So the short answer would be I'm French. But obviously, some people would ask about my appearance. And I would say, yeah, my mother is also Japanese. So I have a bit of a multicultural, international background. So the short answer is French. But actually, it depends. Sometimes when I go back to Europe, I say I'm Canadian now. In Japan, I say I'm French, and I would say sometimes for people who are really into the Japanese culture, I'm Japanese, depending on where I am. Or like in the States also, I would say I'm from France because Canada is not that exotic, or Japanese. So it's really, I play with my nationalities a bit.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I can relate to that a little bit, being like Russian Canadian. When I was in Texas, I didn't say Russian because I knew people would think it's too exotic. And I said Canadian. And one woman goes, "Oh my Lord, Canada." I'm like, it's literally the country next door. Like there's no closer country to your country. But I get that as well. Like depending on where you go, depending on how people feel about certain cultures, you utilize one of those cultures, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But do you feel more French? Do you feel more Japanese? Do you feel like a mixture of both?
It's an excellent question, and the thing is that it also changed over time. So basically, when I was a child, I felt definitely more Japanese. Japanese is the first language I've ever spoken. I used to speak it with my mother, with my siblings. It's also the first writing system I learned with my mother, who happens to be she used to be a teacher back in Japan. So she was really into the teaching stuff. And so the first family language was Japanese. My father was not really around at the time. And I also received materials like children's books, like manga from my Japanese grandparents. So the funny thing is that Pokemon, I read Pokemon when it was a manga long before it was so popular around the world. So yeah, definitely more Japanese at the time. And then when I entered school, then that's when things changed. It was a French school, and the Japanese culture was not so popular at the time. So I had to adapt to the French culture. I started watching French movies, listening to French music. I don't know if you're familiar with French-Belgian comic books as well, Tintin, Lucky Luke, or Spirou. So that's the kind of things I started reading. And at the end of high school, I definitely felt more French than any other nationality. But then after that, I took a gap year to travel around Europe, and I attended university in Paris. And while being a student in Paris, I also started working in a Japanese restaurant, and I started studying the language again, connect to the culture once again, and also traveling to Japan by myself. So that's really when I felt a deeper connection. My grandparents passed away at the time. It was all by myself, but I definitely feel more French and Japanese than after high school. And the Lebanese part is a bit not there, because my Lebanese grandmother passed away long before I was born, and my father doesn't speak Arabic. So the only memories I had back then was cousins of my father visiting us in Paris with perfect French and English. So yeah, it was. But then in 2019, I traveled to Lebanon, and it was discovering the culture. Lebanese people are one of the most generous and welcoming people in the world, and I really felt like being part of the family there. So I'm studying, I'm getting to know the culture, the language today, but it hasn't been the case before. And now I live in Canada. I became Canadian. So I'd say, yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, but it all comes down to my personal experience. But today, I'd say I'm a cocktail of a bit of French, Japanese, Lebanese, and Canadian, with French and Canadian being the dominant aspects of my personality.
Have you ever wondered, like, which parts of your personality are more Japanese and which are more French? Have you ever sat down to think like, oh, this thing that I do is actually quite Japanese? You know what I mean?
Well, that would be more, I don't know, everyday things. Like I have a rice cooker, so cooking rice, eating rice, using chopsticks every day. That's very Japanese.
I have a very important question. Have you ever eaten natto?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I love natto. I don't eat it every day, but yeah, it's the kind of things that I grew up with. And I think it's an acquired taste.
Yeah.
I don't think it's for everybody. And I know that Japanese people tease foreigners with natto, but yeah, I eat less natto than rice for sure. But yeah, it's also, I always have natto in my freezer. The French part, I always have wine and cheese also in my fridge. So yeah, and I think also the French part would be being very analytic about things. Some like we have that reputation of criticizing everything, and it's not always bad. Sometimes you just want to analyze things and make the right choice. So and sometimes it's like if you go to France, to Paris, and you go to cafes and you see people sitting and just disserting or discussing about politics and stuff like that. I feel like I still kept that part strongly. And when I try to speak to Quebecois people or to Canadian people that are really interested in necessarily history or politics, and I see that there's a bit of a cultural clash there.
Yeah, that is very interesting, I find, because when it comes to communication, Japan and France is so different, right? Like Japanese, I feel like there's so much about harmony and not, offending and not stirring the pot, and just everybody should be like not being very direct as well with how they communicate. I don't know that French are direct, but as you said correctly, like French like to criticize and debate and argue, and that's really part of a really good, healthy conversation and can offend some people, maybe Canadians included, right? So that's interesting. Did you lean more into like that French side of it, or do you also find like kind of indirectness that comes with the Japanese part of your culture?
Yeah, I adapt actually. If I speak to a Japanese person, I'd be more Japanese. If I speak to a French person, I'd be more French. On an international level, I think, well, actually, yeah, in Canada or the States, I'd be more diplomatic, but I'd lean more towards the French side, because Japanese culture or the Japanese way of speaking is very tricky. And you mentioned that they're very, like, the way of communication is very indirect, and it's really about the context. So you have like three things you need to keep in mind. The first one is the linguistics. So linguistically speaking, they remove subjects when they're obvious. So if you didn't pay attention, or if you does out of the conversation, that's when miscommunication can happen. And then there is also the fact that sometimes they don't finish sentences because it's too It's too confident. It's too like I show my vision, my opinion, my way of thinking, and it's too brutal. So if the rest of the sentence is obvious, then you wouldn't finish it. So even just asking what's your name, the sentence would be onamae wa nan desu ka? What is your name? But then they'd just say onamae wa? Your name is just, that's the most polite way to ask the question, actually. And the last part would be the sentences that have a different meaning. So, and this is, I think, the trickiest, the most difficult. So, for instance, if you go to Kyoto, they do that a lot. If you go have tea with someone that was planned, but you didn't plan on having dinner with that person, and then, you start talking and you're having a nice conversation, it's 6:00 and the person says, oh, would you like to stay for dinner maybe? Then it's your cue to leave. Then you should understand, if you didn't plan it, that you realize that she's asking you to leave. So, oh wow, it's already that time. No, I should go. I should probably go. So these are the kind of things, the cultural things that you need to know in order to really be Japanese and communicate with Japanese people.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Japan is a high context culture, right? So it's like a lot of things are left unsaid, and you kind of have to I think you have to pay attention to the body language a lot more than you would, let's say, maybe France is also high context, they say, but I think not to that point. It's all on a spectrum. But that is so interesting that if someone says, would you like to stay for dinner? Actually, don't. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because they don't know how to kick you out, right? They're not going to say like, sorry, but I have to eat, right? Please, like, could you leave?
Oh, yeah. And let's say you're from Canada, you go there, and then you're in this context, and the person says, oh, would you like to stay for dinner? But it wasn't planned, and you don't know about that. And you say, yeah, sure, let's stay and speak more. Then that gets really awkward, because she's going to try to find ways to say, well, we had things planned with our family, and so you don't want to be in that situation, because it makes Japanese people very uncomfortable. But if you don't know, you don't know for sure. But yeah, it's you can get in. I mean, it's also part of the beauty of cultural exchanges. But yeah, it's very tricky, and you'll get these kind of things a lot.
I love this, because I can imagine if someone's like an Israeli or like a Dutch person comes over to like a Japanese person's house, I just wonder how that would go, right? Because then they're going to say, okay, well, I'm assuming that this person means that, right? I mean, very direct culture to very indirect culture, but you have to really read the cues and understand that they're being very polite. But that is so interesting. Has that ever happened to you? Like, you've been to Japan. Have you had those kind of culture shocks or anything that was, I mean, you know the culture quite well, right? So I guess maybe not a lot of things surprised you. But have you been in that situation, something like you describe in this, where people said, would you like to stay for dinner or anything similar?
Yeah. These kind of things I know. I have two brothers living in Tokyo, so I try to go as much as possible. I actually have also a nephew now. So I love Japan. I love the food. I love how clean it is. I love how respectful people are. And as you mentioned, I've never lived there per se, but I stayed there maybe, I went there maybe 6 times. And every time I try to stay at least 2 weeks to a month. So I have my habits. I know my way around, metro stations. Sometimes you're a foreigner and it's crazy, because these stations, they're the most crowded in the world and you don't know where to go. But I know where to go always. It's also a cash country, so I always have cash on me. I know how things work. Yeah, I think that the part, and it's related to my physical appearance, the part that bugs me the most is when people are stubborn in not wanting to speak in Japanese. And some people in comments might say, yeah, well, they mean well. But there's a difference between them speaking fluent English, and if that's the case, then of course let's switch to English and it's going to be easier for everybody. Or someone who clearly doesn't speak English or doesn't speak as well as I do speak Japanese, and they still want to show. I don't know if it's about showing or if it's unconscious or what, but it gives I get it as Japanese is for us Japanese people and English is for foreigners. And so sometimes it's very, very frustrating, because you're trying to have a conversation, but the conversation is it can't go on because the person is just looking for their words in English and trying to communicate. And it doesn't work. And it's also like, it's not that I want to like, I don't want to say bad things about Japan or Japanese people. It's not everybody, but people who are fluent in Japanese and are not Japanese or don't look Japanese, they would face this experience, and it's not really nice. So it's something, and of course, when I'm facing that kind of situations, I would feel like an outsider. I would feel like a stranger. But apart from that, no, it's all the small things, like indirect things. Of course, sometimes even between Japanese people, you'd have miscommunication if the transition of the subject is not clear. And I'm fluent in Japanese, so it's not really something that I'm facing. But really, this specific point, this specific situation where people don't want to speak in Japanese to you, is something that's a bit annoying.
Yeah, because I guess you get that in both places a little bit, right? Like in Japan, you're not fully considered Japanese. And in France, they're always asking, oh, well, what else? Like, what are you mixed with, right? What's your other background? So does that ever affect you? Do you ever think like, I don't belong anywhere? Do you ever get that feeling, or you like that?
No, it's funny because in Canada, I don't feel that at all. Canada is an immigrant country, if I may say. So it's when I say of course I have my background. I'm French and Japanese, but then people don't ask me if I say I'm Canadian. Nobody questions that, and it's something that I like here in Montreal and also in Toronto. I think Toronto was elected or was chosen as the most multicultural city in the world. So that says a lot. But yeah, in France, I think in France I get that less than in Japan. And to be fair, my Japanese is good, but I don't sound like a native, like someone who was born and raised there. So it's a bit more normal that I would get these kind of comments in Japan rather than in France. But yeah, for sure. It's, I don't know. I wouldn't say I like it being different. During my teenage, it was difficult. I wanted to fit in, but I was different. Now I'm more confident and it's not a problem, but yeah, it gets annoying, especially knowing the fact that I have ancestors in both France and Japan and not being fully accepted. But at the end of the day, we're all different, and it's fine. These people, they want to think that it's fine. We can, if they don't want to consider me as French or Japanese, then we can move on. But I wouldn't say I like it, but I live with it. I'm comfortable with it. Now I've chosen my country, because you don't choose where you're born. You don't choose your parents. You don't choose your background. But you can choose where you go. And I chose Canada, and I'm really happy about it today.
Hey guys, I just wanted to take a second to thank you all for tuning into this podcast. These podcasts take so much work, so any of your support is much appreciated. If you have a second, please go and give it a follow and a 5 stars if you really enjoyed it. Now, back to the episode. What did it feel like to grow up as a third culture kid in France? You mentioned that you were trying to fit into that kind of society.
Yeah. Well, technically, I wouldn't say I'm a third culture kid, because my dad is French. I have a French grandfather, so. But yeah, I was treated differently for sure. And also, it's funny because I looked more Asian when I was a kid than I do now. But the first shock was in school, in primary school. I got discriminated by my classmates, by my teachers. And even my teacher said to my mom, because obviously at the beginning I was only speaking Japanese, so my French wasn't that good, and I got scolded because of that. And the teacher said to my mom, it's it would be better if you stop speaking Japanese until he reaches that intermediate to upper French level. But she luckily she didn't continue. It's normal for kids who have different languages at home to take a bit more time in their learning. But eventually, that we caught up, all my siblings and I. But and the Japanese culture back then was not so popular again. Even Caucasian kids who were too much into anime or video games would be called weeb, even in North America, weeaboo, weeb. So I received a lot of degrading comments in high school. Also, it was very difficult to date, to find someone, because Asian people were not considered attractive. So I actually wrote and published a book about it. So it's just funny just to go back to the things that I went through as a child. That being said, I had role models. I had Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan. I was also practicing martial arts. So people didn't want to, there wasn't physical bullying, but it didn't prevent verbal bullying. But then, yeah, it's all in the past now. And as I said, I traveled around Europe because I wanted to get as far away as possible from all that. But when I came back, I attended university in Paris, and everything changed. Everything changed. Anime, video game, they all became mainstream. There was this event, still going on, Japan Expo, which is like a Comic-Con, but for Japanese culture. It's the biggest in Europe, and I believe it's the biggest outside of Japan. Then there was also the Korean wave. Korea played a big part in, promoting the Asian culture through K-drama, K-pop. And so there was less discrimination, and dating and stuff like that was not as hard as it was back in high school. But that being said, I also received demeaning comments from Japanese coworkers when I was working at the Japan Expo or in Japanese restaurants as a student. So yeah, I was discriminated on both sides, French and Japanese.
So you wrote a book about this. I had no idea. Are there any stories in there that you would be interested in sharing about like some of the experiences that you've had? Maybe people can relate to that, growing up, not really feeling like they fit in.
Yeah, well, the bullying was pretty bad, I'd say. So I described that in the book. I also talk about I wrote it in 2016, so it's a bit old, and I would rewrite it today and change a few things. But yeah, I mean, classic things like people making fun of you because you're Asian. I don't want to be vulgar, but the size they say size do matter when you're Asian, or just making fun of you eating rice and just throwing rice at you, or things like that. But I think hopefully things have changed. I don't know if it's still the case in some more remote areas in France or in Europe. I know that in Europe, the politics is more and more leaning towards far right, sides and parties. So I'm not really into that, but hopefully there is more understanding of people growing up in environments like that. And luckily I'm really confident today, and I made it. I didn't prevent me from getting my bachelor's degree, moving to Canada, getting my master's degree here, having a job and stuff. So as long as you can overcome it, maybe the people who would need it are people who are facing that, and just standing up for yourself. The problem also back then was that people were maybe seeing what was happening but didn't really intervene. So also other people witnessing these kind of situations, intervening and saying, that's wrong and you shouldn't be, bullying shouldn't be okay anywhere in the world. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Can I ask you what city did you live in?
I lived in the suburbs of Paris.
I see. Okay. So you live close to Paris, right? Which is pretty very multicultural these days, right? But
it is multicultural, but depending on where you are, my town was very, very Caucasian. I think in my school there was one Arabic person, one black, and one Asian. So we're like a trio, and eventually we became friends. But there were a lot of other European people, like Portuguese. I know that some of them also felt discriminated, but it was a bit different, and they were Caucasian. So mainly French white people. That was the dominant. Yeah.
There are quite a lot of Portuguese in France in general. I know that. And now also French in Portugal for that reason as well. But it's funny though, for me, because like we talked about Canada being a very accepting country, and I genuinely I've never had any issues. But when I first arrived to Toronto, and I went to the most immigrant school ever. I was in Scarborough. If anybody knows Toronto, this is like the most immigrant, it's mostly like Indian and Asian kids. But I went to this school that I went to when I was 12 years old. I remember there were certain things that I did that were quite Russian. Like there's some gestures that I do. Like if we say someone's crazy in Russia, we do this. Like, oh, you're like, you know what I mean? And I would do these kind of things. And I got made fun of so much because like, oh, you're so Russian, or you're so this, or you're so that. And I remember it wasn't as bad as, it could have been. I never really, really got bullied. But you do feel like you have to start fitting in a way, even though no one's really from Canada. That's the funny thing. But I can imagine if it's like a French society and you feel like you stand out, there's certain things you start to do to try to fit into that more. Did you do anything that you were like, you know what, I don't want to get singled out. I want to fit into this culture. Did you start acting more French as a result?
Oh, for sure. I mean, first of all, the language, I stopped speaking Japanese at all. I even answered back in French to my mother. So the language, because my siblings were 2 years and 3 years apart with my brother and my sister. So we would sometimes see each other and we would actually stop speaking to each other. So not only did we start speaking in French, and it's still the language today, but we also stopped speaking to each other because it was like Asian people getting together. Oh, actually, there was a Vietnamese family, I remember now. We're really close to them. But apart from that, no, yeah, I stopped reading manga. I still played video games, but I started reading French stuff, watching French movies. And just to fit in, sometimes people would say, oh, did you watch that movie or did you watch that show that's going on TV? And you want to have a conversation. You want to have something to talk about. So obviously you would adapt to what people watch and what people listen to. So yeah. And then also I had to be, because my French was weak. So I studied French even more to show that I had mastered the language and to show that I could fit in, but there were always people who didn't see that and who saw the different eyes, different skin color, and who would make fun of that. So yeah, as much as, I mean, you can do everything, but then if they don't want to accept you, then that's their choice. But eventually I still had friends. But I guess, yeah, the hardest part was probably dating girls saying that, no, you're not my type. No, I would never date an Asian guy. Things like that got to me, and I became so shy. Even to this day, dating is very difficult because I'm so scared of rejection. Everything is going well, everything is fine, but still, I'm really, really, really shy when it comes to that. And I think it's from that time where people conditioned me into thinking that Asian people are not attractive.
So going off of the topic of dating just a little bit, I don't know whether you would be willing to share any of those experiences. You mentioned like just being conditioned to think that Asians were not sexy. That kind of impacted your confidence going forward with asking people out.
Yeah. Well, it's as I mentioned, a few comments saying that well, Asians are nerds, and it was also portrayed like that in movies. I don't know if you remember, like Spider-Man. It's always the best friend who's either a bit chubby or dorky, with the glasses, who is a bit of a nerd. But who helps the main hero, who's, well, now they're trying to bring that more, black or Hispanic or even Asian people in front of the scene being the superhero themselves. But back then, he was always like this nerd who could be really awkward with girls, and so there was nothing we could do about it. It was just the image, and girls weren't attracted by that, and maybe they didn't want to, like, in terms of image, be like the girl who dates the Asian guy, So I'm not quite sure. I mean, again, things have changed now, and it's definitely more multicultural. And some people they know more about the Japanese culture, the Korean culture. Korean people also, they have to go to the military service. They have to complete that in 2 years. So most of them are actually pretty, they have a lot of muscles and stuff. So they're very hot. And so the image has changed. There's still a lot to do, I think. But yeah, it's well, it's I don't know what to say. I'm working now. Today, I'm confident, but definitely you have like scars from the past, and it's not a bad thing, today. Then being shy is not a bad thing, and it doesn't prevent you from actually meeting people and starting talking. Actually, you want that. You want to have a genuine conversation rather than the usual pickup artist that's really, about sleeping here and there. And I guess also in the Asian culture and the French culture, we try to be a bit more conservative when it comes to dating, in the sense that you would want ultimately to find someone to spend your life with. someone you consider your best friend, someone you can trust. So I think we aim for more quality kind of relationships rather than just, sleeping around, which I don't judge, of course, like everybody's free. But yeah, that's also the education I got from my parents. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I can see you as a kind of Keanu Reeves, or you're like a mix, right? So maybe you've gotten that in the past. So when Keanu Reeves was really famous too.
It's more recent, actually. Some people say, because he's got some Chinese genes, I think. And he was also born in Beirut. He's one of my favorite actors. He's really humble, and
Yes.
And he played the bass. He has a motorcycle, so we have so many things in common. If I had to meet one celebrity, probably Keanu Reeves. I was also, some people said I look like Justin Trudeau as well. But I mean, he's maybe if he like Asian Justin Trudeau, if you will. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting too that you mentioned, like, it's funny how the way people's minds work, like, oh, Asian people are not cool. They're associated with everything nerdy. All of a sudden, K-dramas take off, K-pop, all this Japanese culture, everybody becomes obsessed with it. Oh, now Asians are cool, right? Or those specific Asian countries, at least. And all of a sudden, everything changes. It is really funny, isn't it? How that can affect your life, like how people perceive you. But speaking of the dating scene, like comparing France to Canada, I've talked to, when I was in Montreal a few weeks ago, and I did a video on dating in Montreal. Again, I've done a couple, and I talked to French people, and what you mentioned is very interesting when you say that French people date a little bit more seriously with the intention of at least finding someone. Like, dating around is not much of a thing as it would be in Canada. Have you noticed that personally? Have you noticed that difference?
Well, it's funny because we say Canada, but I think Quebec is also different from the rest of Canada. You have some, like in Alberta, they're more conservative there. So I don't know what's the policy. It might be closer to the States where, for example, you don't sleep with a person on the first date. But yeah, for sure. It's completely different. In France, usually when you start dating someone, you're together. And it's clear you don't have to say it. You're together, and then you start introducing. I mean, of course, you go on dates, but then implicitly you're not going to go around and go on other dates. That's weird. Whereas here you can play around. You can just until you have that conversation, are we together or not? And I knew that about the culture when I arrived here. And also the women here are really strong. I think it's a good thing. But they come to you and they're straightforward and I like you. Would you like to go on a date? So that makes it easier for French people coming here. And I believe some French people actually come for that. They're not really successful back in France, but they come here and suddenly people start, talking to them and inviting them for shots or beer. So it feels good, obviously, for the confidence. I think more people also here in Canada are attracted to Asian people because of the academic background, in the sense that Asian families, they really push their children to study, to have a university degree, to make money, to be serious in life. And so I've seen Quebec girls who got that yellow fever and who are aiming for an Asian person because they're tired of the Quebecois guy who's working in construction and who makes a lot of money, but who's not really educated. So we have a lot of that too. But yeah, definitely. I think that the main difference would be between Canada and France in general would be how official things are. And in that sense, we're a bit more conservative. Japan is a different story. Japan, you have to say everything even before you kiss the person. Like, we are friends. Can we start dating? Then you start dating. Then you go for the kiss. And even that, I mean, you might ask for the kiss. Like, I think it's a good time to kiss. What do you think? Yes, let's kiss. And you have a place to do that. Like, you don't do things in a specific room. You don't do that in a kitchen. You don't do that. Whereas here it's a bit more free, and it's it's a different way to approach this kind of relationships.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are a few points that I wanted to touch upon. I mean, the one that, of course, Japanese people, it's very funny, that practice of kokuhaku, like this talking to each other, right? And the conversation that you have, it's very much like you really need to know what label you're going to attach to this thing that you're doing, which I think French people don't do. French people go with more of the feeling, I like you, let's kiss, let's start dating. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We'll know in a few months. And then the Quebecois are, they're more like free spirited, but they'll also do the dating around like very much American style that like, oh, we can be seeing a few different people at the same time. It doesn't mean that we're exclusive right off the bat. That's interesting. You do mention something that's very interesting as well, and that's yellow fever. A lot of times when I talk about yellow fever, I talk about it with women. But how does that make you feel if a woman's going out with you and she's like, you know what? I only date Asian guys. Like I have a thing for Asian guys. Do you feel offended or are you just like, well, good for me, I guess?
Yeah, no, it's funny because I struggled in primary, middle, and high school, but girls didn't struggle. There's always been that fantasy about the Asian girl who's super shy, but in bed she's like a not a monster, but like she's the master fantasy. Yeah, and I think I've seen some data from Tinder. And they said that the most successful girls, the least successful guys were the Asian guys, and the most successful girls were, I think, Caucasian and Asian, and in North America. So yeah, I think it's different. I think Asian guys who date girls like that, they wouldn't mind because it's been difficult for them to find someone. So even if the person is exclusively dating Asian guys, I don't think it's as bad as a girl feeling fetishized, if that makes sense.
No.
Obviously, there's a bit of, we all have preferences, right? Personal preferences. So, and that's difficult to pinpoint. Like, is it a personal preference or are you being racist?
Yeah.
And then you're putting, ethnicities on a pedestal, and Asian is like your fantasy, and you're going for that because you fetishize it. So I wouldn't promote that obviously in the best world, but again, it all comes down to personal preferences, and if you're into that, go for it. But still, it's weird if you ask me, because personally it shouldn't be about the ethnicity, it should be about shared values. So obviously some countries share the same values, and so you'd connect more with, well, let's say, I think in Russia they're also more conservative, getting married, having children, and Japan is also about that. So obviously you fit more with someone who share the same value, the same values, family values, financial values, also educational. Asian people tend to be more educated, and that puts a lot of pressure also for Asian people who are not educated, but that's a different story. So if you're looking to take all these boxes, then you have more chances with certain nationalities. But again, I don't think it should be about ticking boxes. I think if you have a good connection with the person and you share fundamental core values, the same core values, then you should go for it. And because I know people who are not Asian, but who grew up in Asia and who have the same values as Asian people. These are true third culture kids, and they would go out with people from the country usually. So yeah, it's
yeah, sexual preferences is such an interesting conversation, right? Because personally, I think, okay, you can definitely have your sexual preferences or your romantic preferences. You can say like, I'm really attracted to, let's say, this type of look. Let's say I really like Latinos. I know people that just really, really like Latin American guys. And maybe there's an association with that culture. Like, oh yeah, they're going to be passionate. They're going to tell me I'm out 20 times a day. They're going to do all those things that I like crave, So I get that as well, but I also get, like, and you said correctly, like, it's so interesting how women, the yellow fever thing was mostly for women up until the whole K-drama thing and K-pop and all this fascination with Korea. There wasn't much of like a fetish around Asian men, or at least not that I've heard of. There might have been. And now, like, you see like swarms of women going to Korea to find a Korean husband, for example, right? So many girls are into that. So it's just interesting. And I think it's interesting how the portrayal of a culture really does make a difference. You mentioned before, like, Asian guys were portrayed as nerds. Now they're portrayed more as sexy. And, of course, like, we have the metrosexual, gentle masculinity that Korean men have, right? I'm not talking about Japanese, but again, Japanese also have that kind of fascination with a lot of Japanese just culture, like being more available to people around the world, So it's very interesting. And you're right with those statistics. I think Black women got really the short end of the stick on those apps as well. They, whether it was like physical or like association, I'm not really sure, but I think it was easiest for white men and Asian women to find a partner, something like that. And I think it's that submissiveness that is associated with Asian women, right? Because a lot of men want a woman who is feminine and sweet and caring, and she's so gentle. But those same qualities associated with a man are not as sexy, right? Because like nice and feminine and sweet man is not what most women would want. And so Asian men, they got associated with that. And it's not true for everybody, especially if you come, it's definitely not true for most people, right? Or I'm not really sure. I'm not going to get into that because I don't know how true it is. It might be true to an extent. But again, Asia is such a big continent as well. And you get all sorts of people. But even with you, you're like mixed. You're not fully Japanese, but you still get thrown under that same, Asian guy, right? Which makes it harder for you. And also,
back then, yeah. But today, a lot of people think I'm Latino. Actually, here in Canada, people start speaking to me in Spanish. When I went to Mexico, just people randomly think I'm from there. So I have a different experience today than I had back then. But just to mention, Japanese guys and Korean guys are actually pretty assertive. They're actually pretty strong. They're a very conservative countries, so they don't share the same qualities. Physically, yes, they have that perfect skin. They're 50 years old. They look like 25-year-old guy. But in terms of character, they need to be strong. They need to provide. So although Japanese people, in terms of style, that have long hair, Japanese guys would have long hair. They're a bit skinny. But in the relationship, they should be the one making the decisions. And so Japanese girls would be like, I don't know what to do. And the guy has to make the decision. What do you want to go out tonight? And the girl says, I don't know. Yeah, okay, let's go out tonight. Where do you want to go? I don't know. Let's go to a sushi place. Oh, that's perfect. And the girl would be happy with that. So guys have to make the decision, at least in Japan. And I believe it's the same in Korea.
Yeah. But having said that, I think Japanese women are so... they really want them. You're right. They really want the man to lead, and they're never going to be outright saying, this is what I want to do. They're like, no, I want you to decide. Or like they want the man to really take charge, right? But I think like if a Japanese guy goes out with a westernized woman, that's going to be very, very hard dynamic, right?
Oh yeah. It's it's very difficult when you have clashes, and Japanese guys are not used to clashes, so sometimes they just stop talking and they would create and then again we said that Japanese is about avoiding communication because it's in the things you don't say or things that you say that mean different things. So male Japanese or male Korean with a Western girl is I think a very challenging couple. It works. I mean, so some people do make it work, but it's going to be a big struggle for both.
Exactly. Yeah, because I've heard that for many Japanese guys, Western women can be too direct, too assertive, almost like in their masculine energy compared to Japanese women, of course. So that is interesting how certain time, like you definitely see more Western guy, Japanese girl dynamic than you ever see the opposite. And maybe that's going to change. We never know, right? With Korea, that's happened. So we don't know how that's going to work.
Yeah. I mean, they still, we talked about fetishizing Asian women, but it's the same thing over there. It's something that we don't really talk about. But Japanese or Korean guys fantasizing about having a blonde girl. The blonde girl is the top one. Russian girls, they're so successful. They're Russian or American. Blonde with blue eyes is the top you can get. And sometimes it's about the fantasy. So they get that girlfriend and they realize, oh, wow, no, this is too challenging for me. And they break up and they end up with a Japanese girl. So that's something that I've seen a lot.
What a great point. I think it's so true that a lot of times we're drawn to the exotic factor of another culture. Like, as you said, blonde hair, blue eyes, Russian girl, not me. But and you get that and you realize, oh, in theory, I'd wanted to date someone or even to show to others that I was with a different culture, and then you realize it just doesn't work. And certain cultures, I hate to say it, but I always say it, it's just harder for them to make it work unless they're international. Like, for example, I mean, you're not a great example because you are mixed and you're not Japanese or French, or you're a little bit in between, right? But for example, even if you were born in Japan, but you were as international as you are, and you knew all these languages, and you'd moved abroad, you would be much more. It would be much easier for you to find connection with a different culture. But if you're like born in Japan, you live in Japan your whole life, you're set in your ways. You don't even question the way that you do things. and then you meet that girl from a different culture, it could totally break a relationship. I think these cultural differences, I think even like just for me, what's interesting is how tactile some cultures are. And I feel like in Japan, there's a discomfort with showing that affection. And I always say, I would say Brazilian, Brazilians are very comfortable with affection.
Yeah.
And I just imagine those two getting together, and one is just so cringing, so uncomfortable with the amount of affection and the words. And it's just the other person feels like they're not getting enough of that. So maybe this girlfriend doesn't love him enough, so that's, I think, such a great contrast.
But it's so funny because there is a big Japanese community in Brazil. So I think it'd be interesting to interview someone from there, like a third or fourth generation Japanese, because I feel like they still stick together. So sometimes you have like pure Japanese, even after fourth generation, but they're Brazilian, so they speak both, or even sometimes just Portuguese. So, and from what I've seen, they're in the middle. So they're not that touchy, but definitely more than Japanese people from Japan.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Exactly. Like there's so many Japanese in Brazil. That would be an interesting conversation because what parts of you do you feel are more Brazilian and what parts are more Japanese, But let's talk about culture shocks upon arriving to North America as a French person. And what have you experienced? And maybe also, what is something that you didn't quite feel a connection to in France? Was there something that you just felt like, I don't know, that I want to stay in France because of factor X?
No, it was actually quite the opposite. I wanted to move away from France. The main reason also that just seeing the nature, it's such a big country. I think also the mentality, we'll come back to that. I didn't feel that big of a cultural shock because I did my homework. I knew what I was expecting. Something that's not a shock, but I know it's a bit tricky, especially people who work in that field, the tipping policy. So I knew about that before coming, 15%, almost everywhere in Canada. And that's a big difference in Japan because in Japan it's rude to tip. And if you tip, people would just not understand. They would go back to you and go after you and say, "Oh, you forgot your money." So I used to work as a waiter back in France. I worked as a busboy and as a waiter here when I was studying as well. And so it's very different, the dynamic. And it's not something I'm a big fan of, putting that pressure on the client. And feeling like even if the service was just normal, first of all, like sometimes you feel like the waiter is working for the tip and not necessarily to offer the best service, and also feeling cheap just giving 15%, so you want to give more, like 16 or 70%, and also now it's a bit annoying because they ask tips everywhere. You go to McDonald's, they ask a tip, and then you go to Subway, they ask a tip. So I feel like it used to be a good part of the Canadian culture, being generous and wanting to give to the people who gave you your service. But I feel like now as a customer, it's a bit too much. It's everywhere. And also with inflation, the economy is getting more difficult. I'm a bit tired of this tipping policy, which is not the case in France or in Japan. Tipping in France, you can tip if you want. But only if the service exceeded your expectations. And sometimes it does happen. You go to France and you have a really nice conversation with the waiter, you give more. And in France, we call it pourboire, which is to drink. So you give literally $1 for the waiter to drink after work. In Japan, no, you're not even tip. If you tip them, they'll take it as an insult. It's like giving money to a homeless person. Oh. It's very different. But it wasn't really a shock. I knew about that, and I worked in the field as well. I think the biggest shock is something very administrative, like everything related to finance. I arrived here. I didn't know what was different. Well, I knew the difference, but I didn't know how to strategically use or successfully use a debit card and a credit card. In Europe, we only have one. It's like a debit credit, but it's more like a debit card. Also taxes, reporting your taxes, doing them every year. In France, it's just automatic. We only pay taxes to the country. Here you have the provincial, and then you have federal taxes. So these were the biggest challenges for me.
Just touching off the tipping, I think it's gotten to the point of ridiculous. I was actually when I was in Montreal, I went to Atwater Market and I went to buy bread, And they asked me to tip for the bread. I'm like, you did nothing. You gave me the bread. And the worst thing about it, what I find just the most irritating, they'll give you the machine and the first option in many places is 18%.
18.
And I don't want to give you 18%. So imagine you're on a date and you just feel like your date is looking at you. Let's say you're a guy paying for the woman and you don't want to look cheap and keep looking for the other options, right? So you just click 18% because that's easier. And I just imagine like, for me, it's not fair. You should give other options. And sometimes there's not even an option of 15%. You have to do it manually as a number. You have to do it manually as like $1, $2, $3. So you have to calculate that. And that amount of stalling makes you look super cheap. Like, why are you taking so long to process, how much it's going to take to tip this person? And you're right. It's now for ridiculous things. Like a friend of mine in Montreal, she said she was filling up on gas and it was a self-serve and they still gave her like, who are you tipping at this point? Are you tipping yourself?
That's insane.
It's crazy. Yeah. It really, really is. I agree with that. I was in Spain once and I left a tip and the woman ran after me and she was like, you forgot your money. And I said, no, it's for you. And she was so confused. Yeah. Yeah. Like as you
in
said,
Spain, that's weird. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going again in 2 weeks, so I'll give you an update on that. Maybe it's changed, but that's how it used to be, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Definitely not 18%.
Yeah. No, that's insane. And technically, also, if you really wanted to be cheap, because I mean, it's difficult, difficult times today. So you need to save as much as possible. And technically, it's 15% from the price before taxes. But then, of course, the 15% on the machine is on top of the taxes. So what we do here, if you want to calculate easily, you just look at because we have 15% here. We have 10% Quebec and 5% for the federal. So you just look at the taxes and you add them up and you give that manually. That would be the technique. Still, you would look cheap, but I mean,
I don't
if
care.
The person just, yeah. I mean, it's, I don't want to look like a jerk, but I feel like, I mean, of course, sometimes I give more. Sometimes I do receive a spectacular service and I love it. And it depends also on the context. If it's a nice, fancy restaurant, obviously you would want to give more. But if it's McDonald's, come on.
Yeah, if it's a fancy restaurant, you're going there with the intention of spending money. You're going there because you're going out, right? If you're getting coffee, the only other option is to reach behind the counter and make the coffee yourself, right? So if you're not in that mind space of tipping someone for giving you the coffee, that never used to be the case, by the way. This only happened after COVID. So yeah, I think tipping should be something that you genuinely want to do because someone did a great job, not because you're passively aggressively being forced into it, which is what it feels like a lot of times in Canada. So going out is not that much fun, right? Unfortunately.
Oh yeah, that's something that I miss. I miss a lot about Europe. Going out, the food is cheaper, and also is traveling often. Going out to Italy for the weekend. You get a return ticket for less than $100. Here, in the same country, from Montreal to Vancouver, is the same price as Montreal to Paris. So this is something that I really miss about Europe, traveling. Yeah,
I 100% agree. What about the mentality of the people? What have you noticed?
So I'm specifically going to focus on French versus Canada here. And it's one of the main reasons why I came here in the first place. As I mentioned, France is all about, people make fun of us because we always, on a strike, we're always protesting. And yeah, it's part of it's very rooted in our culture. Also, France is a very generous country if you think about it. We have universal healthcare, where you receive money from the government if you're unemployed. They have excellent parental leave. The average vacation time is 5 weeks per year. So it's great to be in France and to work in France. But the problem is that it's also very comfortable. And if you like a bit of challenge, if you're a bit ambitious, then it's not the country for you. So I'm not saying that France is better than Canada or the other way around. But if you have an entrepreneur mindset, or if you're an investor, first of all, it's difficult to start a business in France. It's way more difficult than here in Canada. But you would want to go for that mentality, because not only is it comfortable to stay and be satisfied with your 9-to-5 job there, but it's also the general mindset. Let's say you have a YouTube channel, I have a YouTube channel. And if you want to start one, the reaction would be completely different there and here. So in France, people would say all the bad things. Well, the market is saturated. There are too many people starting a YouTube channel. It takes at least 5 years to get successful. These kind of things that are not necessarily helping. It's true though. Like they've got a good point. But here it's completely different. You say, I'm going to start a YouTube channel. Then they'd say, oh, do you need an editor, a video editor? I know someone. Oh, I'll hook you up with that person. So it's really more oriented to success. And even if you fail, then at least you tried. But in France, you don't even try because people aren't pushing you to.
Well,
so that's the main difference. Yeah,
it's that American mentality coming to play right here, where it's like, you can do whatever you want to do. You can be anything you want to be. And I think I genuinely don't see a negative in it. Sure, some people and Europeans will say North Americans are fake. They're so fake. They say things they don't mean. And I get that. Sometimes you'll say something to someone, they're like, oh, that's a wonderful idea. And you're like, I actually don't think it's a wonderful idea, but you're obviously trying to support me, right? So it can come off as not very genuine sometimes. But having said that, I mean, if you are starting a YouTube channel where you are trying to get into any of this kind of social media endeavors, people putting you down is not helpful at all. Like, I'd rather fail than to not try at all. I'd rather fail at something that live my life worried about what are people going to think of me? Oh no, am I going to look stupid? One of the French girls that I had on the podcast, she said, like, in France, people will say, well, you need to go to film school, or do you have any experience in this? Like, do you know what you're doing? So you need to be an expert in it before you actually start doing it, which is a lot of pressure. You know, when I got into this, I had no idea what I was doing. I made so many mistakes. I still do. I'm still learning. Like, you're never an expert in anything. You know this, being a YouTuber as well. Like, it's just constant work, trial and error, you know?
No, for sure. It's a very good point. And I don't think it's only about activities or initiatives. Like creating a YouTube channel is the same for everything. And that's one of the main reasons why French people are also really bad in English, is because unless you're bilingual, if you start making mistakes, or if people can tell that you're not fluent, they'll make fun of you, or they'll. And on the other hand, if you're trying to, let's say you're not fluent yet, but you're trying to, you take an American accent or you take a British accent, they'll say, oh, you're pretending.
It's always this big topic of what is fake, what is not fake. And I don't think, I do agree with Europeans, with French people on this point, that Americans they can use a lot of superlatives. This is amazing, that is amazing. If everything is amazing, then nothing really is. But you're right. I think, I mean, apart from like very superficial conversations and very obviously fake people, I still would prefer to be in a society where I feel like I'm allowed to and I'm encouraged to go after the dreams that I want to go after, because I think there's nothing worse than when you have an idea and people just, like, no one believes in you, people are putting you down, or they just look at you skeptically, like you're an idiot, like why are you doing that, you know? So I think that's one of the positives, and that's why the US, for example, is such an entrepreneurial nation, because of this mindset that you can be 60 years old, but if you want to start, I don't know, a TikTok page, go for it. You know, why not? Right? What's the worst that's going to happen? Whereas, no, you're going to look like a fool. Don't do that. You're going to look stupid. Do you know what you're doing before you do it? We never really know what we're doing. That's what I personally think, you know,
but the other side is also, if you manage to make it, if you become successful, then people get jealous. I think it's out of jealousy, but in France, it's the relation to money and to success is not very good. It's the fact that if you, like in America, you're successful, you buy a sports car, a very expensive car, or a boat, everybody's happy for you, you deserve it. In France, it's not the same thing. So before you start, people will be skeptical and will put you down. And if you succeed, then people will criticize you. So you can't win. The only way to win in France is to find a 9-to-5 job that doesn't pay too well or too little, and be satisfied with that. And it's fine, you know. I don't want to judge, but that's the honest truth about the French mentality in general. I'm saying that, but the richest person on earth right now is a French person. That's different, you know. He's Louis Vuitton, LVMH, and stuff like that. But in general, you feel that if you're too successful, then you start seeing people, they stop speaking to you. Because it might be the other way here in North America. People would be interested in just start approaching you. But over there, they put a distance. Oh, you're successful. We're in the same game. But then they'll talk behind your back, right?
Yeah.
So that's the part of the French culture that I'm not really a big fan of.
Is there anything that you miss still about France and living in France?
Well, again, traveling, going to Spain, going to Portugal, going to the UK, Switzerland, all these beautiful countries, Italy. Also the food, obviously, is cheaper. I mean, we have nice restaurants here in Montreal. I'm sure you do too in Toronto, but it's more expensive. We mentioned the taxes and the tipping, and the prices go up and up and up. And I'm not going out as often as I would in France. Actually, Japan is the best, and especially now the yen is pretty low, so it's a good time to travel to Japan. But also maybe this, I'm not realizing it until I'm there and I'm speaking to a French person and I'm just, talking, like taking the time to speak. I feel like, and I might be wrong because I know that people in Quebec, they do that, take time to, let's say, have coffee and just, hang out with friends, one-on-one conversations, and just asking how the person is doing and catching up. But I feel like from my experience, and it might be the choices I made, it's not happening a lot, in the sense that I'm more into a networking kind of mindset. The people I meet, it's not strong, lasting relationships. It's good for networking purposes. We add each other on LinkedIn, and I grow my my network and the people I know. But if I would ask them out on a one-on-one conversation to personally know them, that would be awkward and weird.
Well,
so I'm not, because if I say that, then certainly people in Quebec will say, no, it's not true. We have like family time, family dinner. It's important to be together when we eat and stuff like that. But I feel like I miss that here. That obviously my family is not here with me. I'm by myself. But these are the kind of things that I feel like I'm missing a bit here, more than in France, where even among friends, just go out for lunch, and then you spend the entire afternoon, catching up, talking. Then you have like tea time or coffee, and then you have dinner, and you've been talking the whole time. But I don't feel like, I feel like time is a bit more important here, and you need to work. I have video editing to do. And so when I'm here, I'm more in a working mindset, whereas in France, and also because I might go there for a vacation. But I feel like even then, when I was living there, weekends were for spending time with friends. That was important. Playing pool, playing soccer, playing sports, whatever, more than here.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, as well, like if you compare it to Montreal to Toronto, you'll see a difference there as well, which is Montreal is still has more of a European feeling to it. So people tend to enjoy themselves more compared to Toronto, which is even more Anglo, or it is Anglo. It's more Americanized in that way, where people like, we know all the cliche Montreal people work to live, Toronto people live to work, but that's within Canada. Like Montreal is still incomparable to Europe, in my opinion. I think when people say, oh, Montreal is so relaxed, I'm like, have you been to Europe? Because it definitely has a different vibe still when you compare it to Europe. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the network. I feel like maybe here, yeah, of course you have your friends and you hang out, but it feels like there has to be like a purpose to things more versus just enjoying for the sake of enjoying. Like when I lived in Portugal, which is a great example because Portugal is very laid back, I felt completely different. I was so relaxed, and we used to have dinners that lasted hours. We used to sit on the street, and some woman with half of her teeth in her mouth would make us sardinhas, and we would drink wine, and it was a completely different life. I come back to Canada like, yeah, I work harder, but definitely have less work-life balance. I just have a work-to-work balance. I don't have much of a life. Maybe I don't enjoy it as much because I just felt like it was such an authentic experience there. We just go out, you sit, all you do is just have food and drink, and that's how you spend your weekends or your evenings. And I do miss that. And I think there's definitely truth to that. Maybe people that live in Paris will argue with us and say, you know what? No, it's super stressful in Paris, like, all this kind of stuff. But still, I think there's definitely a difference to the way people approach life. There's less of like a push to achieve something in most places in Europe, or at least like in Southern Europe. If we're talking about Southern Europe, Germany, Scandinavia it's quite different. Though again, in Scandinavia, still there is a work-life balance, I have to say. So I'd say like for most of Europe, maybe except for, I don't know, Switzerland, Germany, like those countries, people enjoy just the simple things more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on this note, Bong, I want to thank you for taking part in the podcast. What a pleasure. It was so great to talk to you. We haven't seen each other in such a long time. And the next time, like the time that we see each other after all these years is through a podcast, but such is life. In 2020.
No, it's super cool. I mean, you wrote to me, I think, when you were in Montreal, but I was in France back then. So I was unlucky. But no, it was really good to be part of your podcast. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with growing up in France as a Japanese. It's interesting for me to listen to that. And guys, if you want to check out Bong's channel, I'm going to link all his socials wherever you were listening or watching this. And go check him out. He does a lot of videos on different languages. He speaks a few languages. How many languages do you speak?
I speak French, English, and Japanese, and I'm studying Spanish, German, Mandarin Chinese, Portuguese, Italian.
Wow. Okay. So you're on your way to becoming a polyglot.
Yes, exactly.
Technically, you could be considered a polyglot, right? You speak 3 languages? Is that a polyglot?
Yeah, technically, yes. I mean, even if you reach an intermediate level or you're a beginner in more than 3 languages, you're technically a polyglot. And hyper polyglot would be from 6 languages to more. So even some people even say that I could be considered a hyper polyglot, but I don't really like putting that label because the expectations are too high.
It's true. Yeah. Okay, Bong, thank you so much. Guys, let us know what you thought about the episode and stay tuned for next week's podcast. See you. Bye.
Bye.